Hello, and welcome to Ipsa Dixit, a podcast on legal scholarship. I'm your host, Brian L. Fry, Spears Gilbert Associate Professor of Law at the University of Kentucky College of Law. My guest is Bob Tarantino, an entertainment lawyer in Toronto and a PhD candidate at Osgoode Hall Law School. We will discuss his dissertation, If You Love Something, Set It Free, Open Content Copyright Licensing and Creative Cultural Expression. So welcome to the podcast, Bob.
Thanks, Brian. Happy to be here.
Yeah, this is so great. I'm so glad to get a chance to talk to you for the first time after having corresponded with you over the internet for a long time. And I absolutely love this dissertation so much. I mean, not only is it a great work of copyright scholarship, but it's about Dungeons and Dragons, which is just like the greatest thing ever, like an entire dissertation about Dungeons and Dragons.
There you go. You come for the copyright, you stay for the D&D. No, I appreciate the kind words. That's very generous of you.
Okay. So we're going to get to the D&D soon, but I want to start with the copyright because that's really the crux of the paper. And the reason you're talking about Dungeons and Dragons and this kind of the social milieu of Dungeons and Dragons, and particularly the creation of the intellectual elements related to Dungeons and Dragons. So in your dissertation, you begin by talking about copyright theory, identifying the prevailing consequentialist and deontological theories of copyright, but also putting a pin in what you refer to as a communicative theory of copyright. So I wonder if you could kind of briefly, for listeners who may not be as familiar with copyright and copyright theory, talk about what those prevailing theories are, sort of what they assume about what copyright law is for, and how the communicative theory you talk about is different and where it came from.
Sure. So, as you mentioned, there's two kind of conventional copyright justification theories. And when I say justification theory, I mean a theory which tries to explain why it is that we have copyright. Because copyright's obviously, an artificial construction. It's an artifact of humans' effort. And so the question becomes, well, why? Like, what is this trying to accomplish? And so the two prevailing theories, I think you can kind of categorize most of the theoretical work into two slots. The first is kind of a consequentialist, or more narrowly, a utilitarian theory, which says what we want to accomplish here is we want to give people an incentive to create works, and we want to give people an incentive to disseminate those works, because we think that society is kind of a better place if people have access to creative cultural expression. And we're going to calibrate the system in a way which maximizes how much work is created and how much work is disseminated in the sort of reach of that dissemination. A sort of adjacent theory, which isn't necessarily contradictory to that utilitarian approach, is a deontological approach, which says that in fact copyright doesn't have a kind of consequentialist slant. What it's really there to do is to recognize pre-existing rights that authors possess as a result of the authorial or creative activity that they engage in. And sort of in broad strokes, again, I think you can kind of place these two conventional groups of theories in kind of continental category. So, the consequentialist utilitarian is sort of an Anglo-American approach, and the deontological is kind of a continental European approach. And, over the last 30 odd years, what you've seen in the copyright literature is kind of a questioning of the appropriateness or the wisdom of approaching copyright using those two lenses, and coming at it instead what I call an orthogonal approach, or refer to as an orthogonal approach. And this comes out of a set of sort of political commitments and descriptions of human psychology and creative activity, which argue that really what we're trying to accomplish with copyright is we're trying to incentivize, but also embed a sort of processual dialogic approach. What we really want to do is not have people sort of create widgets for the purpose of creating widgets, but engage in a cultural conversation. And really the measure of the copyright system should be not how much does it generate, but to what extent does it maximize participation? To what extent does it enable people to sort of enter the cultural flow, to engage with previously existing works, to rework those and develop their own new content that they then, iterate on and release out into the world to sort of further this perpetual discussion, as it were.
Mm-hmm. So I wonder if you could talk just a little bit more about that last theory, because in your paper, you refer a lot specifically to what you call the communicative theory, which you link to the scholar Caris Craig, among others. And I wonder if you could talk about, like, what does communicative mean in that context, and sort of how would we differentiate it theoretically from those other two models?
Sure, and I draw heavily on Dr. Craig's work, and Dr. Craig was my dissertation supervisor, and so I was really, inspired by her scholarship in this regard, and hopefully I've made some contribution to sort of furthering the discussion that she's started. I'll frame this by saying that I think it's accurate to characterize Professor Craig's work as, markedly feminist, and it adopts a critical lens which is really sort of embedded and situational, in the sense that it makes the observation that humans are by nature relational beings. We are defined by a context. We are not these sort of, atomistic monads that kind of, ping pong through a society. We are really the product of the environment within which we are embedded, and the relationships that construe us and that support us. And so the communicative approach draws on that relational author, this notion that nothing is ever, completely new. Everything is really a contribution to an ongoing conversation that builds on previous contributions to that conversation, and that when we communicate, we do so not in a sort of univocal way or a unilateral way. We're not just sort of projecting for the sake of projecting. We're doing it in the expectation that there will be an audience and that there will be a response, and that this sort of cycle of creativity will sort of perpetuate. And so this communicative approach tries to set out a framework which says what we're doing with copyright, or what we want to accomplish with copyright, is maximize the participation of individuals. And so we start not from a proprietarian approach where we say that, the act of creation gives rise to, a sort of full bore property right, capital P, but rather that the act of creation is dialogic, it's communicative, it's intended to be a contribution. And so when we're thinking about how to calibrate the system or how to structure the system, we want to have or be sensitive to the need to enable participation in the system. And so things, it places an emphasis on things like fair use or fair dealing, or copyright term limits or the originality test, as mechanisms for limiting copyright's potential overreach and ensuring that everybody can participate in a meaningful way.
So another concept you deploy frequently in your dissertation is that of open content, or open licensing. So I wonder if you could talk about sort of what is open content, open licensing, what makes a work open versus closed, and how does this idea of openness relate to the communicative theory that you've been describing and its kind of goals in relation to what we think we want to accomplish in relation to copyright law?
So the openness and this concept of open really needs to be juxtaposed with the concept of closed. And so I'll start by talking about sort of a conventional approach to copyright licensing, which is a closed approach and which contemplates really a bilateral relationship between a single licensor and a single licensee. The licensor sets, fairly rigid and predetermined terms on which the licensee can engage with or can use the work, and anything that the licensee does that falls outside of those parameters constitutes infringement. And the licensor, the expectation, I think, on both the part of the licensor and the licensee is that the licensor is going to police those boundaries and is going to, take action if there's any infringement. The open movement really started in the late 70s and early 80s in the context of software. And so for any of your listeners who are familiar with open source software, that's really the start of this concept of open content licensing. And there the notion was, look, rather than software code being proprietary and being locked down and, anybody who wants to use it needing permission to make use of it, let's open it up. Let's make it freely available, freely accessible. And rather than the licensor being concerned with policing the parameters of the permission that's been given, let's make the permission as broad as possible. And say, look, essentially, let's say, look, if you want this code, take the code, use it, do whatever you want with it. You don't have to continually check back or check yourself and make sure that what you're doing is compliant with the terms of some restrictive license. Just sort of have at it, right? We're more interested in incentivizing creativity and incentivizing iterative expression with the code than we are in making sure that our capital R rights are being respected. And the open source software movement has a storied history, which I won't go into. It had a bunch of sort of spin-offs, if I can call them that, including things like the open access movement with respect to government data and open educational materials movement. One of the spin-offs, one of the sort of siblings or children, I'm not really sure which is the right metaphor to use there, is open content. And open content was really taking the principles behind the open source software movement and applying it to what I'll call creative cultural expression. So, software is fairly functional. It's fairly utilitarian. There's clearly room for creativity in it, but the open source software movement was taking place in an environment where people were writing computer code for the purposes of, creating word processing programs and database management programs. Mm. And a group of, forward-thinking folks, including Larry Lessig, got together and said, well, what if we apply this concept to creative works? So like novels and photographs and poems and songs and paintings. And that eventually gave rise to the Creative Commons organization and its suite of licenses. And so that's a set of licenses which are modular and which people can voluntarily pick and choose amongst and apply those licenses to creative cultural expression. And they've been fantastically successful. I mean, the Creative Commons organization was founded in the early 2000s. It was either 2000 or 2001. And in the ensuing, 18, 19 years, more than $1.5 billion works have been licensed using Creative Commons licenses. So there's clearly an appetite out there for people to take this approach with their content, to make it available on an open basis. And by open, again, we mean not worrying too much about what the licensee is going to do with it, and maximizing the latitude that they have to make use of the work that's being made available under the license.
Right. And so that seems consistent with this kind of communicative approach in the sense that it focuses on the ability of people to use material rather than on the ability of the creator of the material to control its use.
Yeah, I think really the underlying principle that characterizes open approaches to content is this principle of use maximization. And so it's
Mm.
making content available, not in a bilateral sense, but in a multilateral sense. So you have a single licensor essentially saying to all comers, have at it, right? I'm making the content available. Here are the terms, which are, fairly simple usually. And I'd like you as the licensee to, make use of this in whatever way you deem fit. Now, there's sort of a spectrum of openness, and even when we look at the Creative Commons suite of licenses, they have a truly open license, or at one end of their range, they have truly open licenses like their public domain dedications, or their CC BY license, which is the only sort of limitation is providing attribution. And at the more restrictive end of the range, you have licenses like the non-commercial and the no derivative work licenses, which impose certain restrictions on what the licensee can make, or the uses that the licensee can make of the content. But generally, and particularly by contrast with more conventional licensing approaches, these are radically different licenses. If you compare sort of a conventional synchronization license that somebody might get from one of the big three music publishers, it looks startlingly different as compared to what you would get under a Creative Commons license.
Mm, mm. So it seems like this kind of open source, open content idea has certain kind of goals that it wants to achieve in terms of outcomes. I mean, there, in a sense, there is a kind of consequentialist flavor to it, as it were. How do we go about evaluating, like, whether or not it works in particular circumstances, why it works in particular circumstances, and to whom that sort of alternative way of thinking about ownership and the relationship to a work of authorship will be attractive?
So that's an excellent question, and thank you for posing it, because that really is kind of the animating approach that I tried to take in the dissertation, was to pose this question of, if you're somebody who has a piece of content, and you're thinking about, how do I disseminate this content? How do I exploit this content? And how would you decide as a owner / licensor whether or not to make use of an open content license for your content? So what I wanted to come up with ultimately was a sort of heuristic which says, here are the different factors that you need to take into account in making that decision. And what I found through my literature review and also through the fieldwork that I conducted was that you can come up with what I've called a matrix of success indicia, this sort of array of different factors or circumstances which get categorized into 4 categories. So we look at characteristics of the licensor, we look at characteristics of the work that's being licensed, we look at the market into which the work is going to be exploited, and we look at the community which makes up the audience for the work. And you can sketch the characteristics of each of these 4 facets of the matrix, and sort of, it's not a quantitative approach in the sense that, look, if you can sort of check off 50% plus one of these boxes, then you're good to go. It's really more of a qualitative approach, which says the more of these characteristics that are present in your circumstances, the more likely it is that you as a licensor are going to find this to be a useful or productive way in which to disseminate your license. And
Right.
so, there's certainly, these licenses are going to appeal to, and therefore I think be useful for, successful for, certain types of licensors, right? If you're a licensor who is quite concerned with the integrity of your work, or with making sure that people don't use your work in a way that you might find offensive or demeaning, open content licensing probably isn't for you. But if you're the type of licensor who's interested in enabling creativity for its own sake, and you sort of prioritize reach as opposed to revenue, amongst a variety of other factors, then open content licensing, I think, is a great option for people. And I think it's a type of license that more content owners should consider, because I think it's going to be productive and useful for more types of products or more types of owners and more types of works than is currently appreciated.
Yeah, and I love the story that you tell in the dissertation about like the path that certain creators took in order to realize that open source, open licensing was an appropriate model for them. But before we talk about that, I wonder if you could kind of situate the study of the paper for listeners. So what you did was a qualitative empirical study of role-playing games, specifically Dungeons and Dragons, and the people participating in the creation of new content in the Dungeons and Dragons sphere. So I wonder if you could just start by, for listeners who might not be familiar, just explaining what Dungeons and Dragons is, where it came from, how it works, and sort of what the history in a nutshell of the sort of Dungeons and Dragons social milieu is.
Happy to do so. And generally I find that, the extent to which I'm going to get along with somebody is usually a function of the extent to which they find this story interesting. So I'll frame it that way. But Dungeons and Dragons is a tabletop role-playing game. So meaning it's not a video game. It's played with paper and pen and in usually a physical environment by a group of players, literally sitting around a table. And it was created in the mid 1970s, and it really was the first game of its type. So in sort of the gaming world, you have different sort of silos of games. There's board games. There's kind of war games, card games. Role-playing games are their own kind of beast or genre, and they were started by Dungeons and Dragons. And Dungeons and Dragons experienced a couple of different periods of incredible popularity, one of which, probably the peak, was in the early to mid 1980s. And, a role-playing game is a game that, frankly, puts a lot of expectations on the players. So players are expected to take on a role. They take on a character who exists in a setting. There is usually a game master in the D&D game. That person's usually referred to as the dungeon master, whose job it is to essentially sort of run the scenarios or run the storytelling encounters. And I think one useful way of thinking about what a role-playing game is it's essentially sort of moderated storytelling or rules-based storytelling where people are creating these narratives using these characters that they themselves control. The D&D game, over the 40 plus years of its existence, has consistently been the most popular role-playing game. It's sort of the giant in its industry. And what happened was, in the 1990s, the game lost popularity. There were some, other competitors that came into the space, video games, and certain types of card games like Magic the Gathering, which really drove down the popularity of D&D. And the game gets released, or historically has been released, in different editions. And as the company that owned D&D at the time, which was Wizards of the Coast, was contemplating the third edition, which would be released ultimately in the year 2000, there was a sales executive there, a guy by the name of Ryan Dancy, who decided, what would be interesting? Why don't we take the ideas that animate open source software and let's apply them to this role-playing game. Let's see if we can open up the system, if we can make it available for free, and see whether that isn't going to have some kind of beneficial effects for our audience. And I think the animating impulse was, it was really in distinction to the previous owners and the approach that they had taken to enforcing their intellectual property rights. They were notoriously aggressive in enforcing their intellectual property rights, both their copyrights and their trademarks, and routinely sued their competitors, routinely threatened to sue their own customers. And the new owners said effectively, we're going to do a 180 on that. We're going to open up the game. And because we think that our audience is a really creative audience, we think that they're really engaged. They clearly want to use this material in a creative way. They want to come up with their own new games, their own scenarios, their own supplements to the game. And we're going to let them do that. And so they did, and they did that in the year 2000. They released the third edition under the Open Game license, which was created specifically for the game. And in the ensuing, 19, almost 20 years now, the game has really seen a resurgence in popularity and cultural sort of impact that I think, at least in part, or I would argue at least in part, is attributable to this open approach that they've taken.
Yeah, I mean, I gotta say, like, what was fascinating to me when reading that part of your dissertation was the way in which the business model and kind of conception of the demand for the product that you describe on the part of the kind of owners of the D&D franchise at the time felt so much like kind of social media before social media. I mean, effectively, they were essentially saying, like, the value of our product is all about the network effects, and the more people we have using our product, the more valuable our product ultimately ends up being. It's just like, we don't want like dilution by alternatives. We want to bring people into the fold and encourage them to collaborate on sort of like a single standard almost.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And what's interesting about the Open Game license and the use of it by D&D is that they were really quite explicit about this. Like, there's all kinds of interviews and statements that are available online from the late 1990s and early 2000s when the owners of the game were saying exactly what you just said, that they were really interested in taking advantage of the network effects that role-playing games enjoyed. There, to me, perhaps the most interesting element of it, though, is something that I think was unexpected. And that was, they originally released the game using the Open Game license, anticipating that what people were going to do was they were going to create new material for Dungeons and Dragons. And they did. The industry sort of blossomed. There were hundreds of new publishers opened their doors and started creating content and selling it. And I mean, I guess just parenthetically, I should note here, it's difficult. It's an incomplete picture if we sort of have this conversation without saying that, this whole phenomenon was really, it was carried along on the back of the internet. I don't think you would have had the same results if they had done this in 1982 before broadband access was available. But in a networked, digitized environment where people could create this content easily and share it easily, there really was sort of this perfect set of circumstances for them to take advantage of the sort of iterative dialogic creativity that this enabled. But the most interesting thing to me was people took the license itself. So what happened was they didn't just take the license and create new material for Dungeons and Dragons. People took the license and created their own new games and released those new games under the Open Game license. And to me, that's fascinating because it was really this repurposing of the license in a way that nobody anticipated. And it's created this whole community or industry of sort of a sub-industry within the larger role-playing game industry of people who make games and content available using the Open Game license. And so there are publishers who create only Open Game licensed material. And these are viable, undertakings. Like these aren't, and it ranges across an incredible spectrum. I mean, some of it is literally, a guy sort of sitting in his bedroom typing stuff up in Word and releasing that. But at the other end of the spectrum, you have very sizable companies with, dozens and dozens of employees and hundreds of products being released that make use of the Open Game license. So the license had an afterlife that I think nobody really predicted. And that I think has really been positive. If you're looking at this from the perspective, really any perspective, but if you're looking at it from the perspective of, did it, result in more creativity? Did it result in more products being created? Did it result in more people participating in creative activity, undertaking their own creative activities and sharing those with other people? And I think across all of those metrics, the answer is, yes, all the way down the line.
And that's really interesting as well to me, because it seems like there's a way in which there's a tendency to kind of conceptualize open content and open source as being like part of like a gift economy and kind of almost like antithetical to commerce. But what you describe is actually a very functional system of commercial exchange in which it seems like the open licenses have actually facilitated commerce rather than made it more difficult.
Absolutely. And you can look at the D&D game itself. The core of the D&D game, the core rules have been available for free, online in Word and PDF documents, licensed under the Open Game License for, nearly 2 decades now. And that does not seem to have hurt the commercial viability of the product whatsoever. If anything, it's stronger now than it has ever been in the past. And there's, again, it's difficult. I don't want to mischaracterize the situation and say that everybody that's participating in this is doing this for the same reasons and is having the same sort of experience. But as you've described, you definitely have a number of players and a large number of players, comparatively speaking, in the industry who are, making a living doing this. Like, this provides, an income, a living wage for lots and lots of people. At the other end of the spectrum, there's lots of people who use it as a mechanism for creating content and putting it out there so that they can build, their own brand or sort of develop their reputation as really innovative and creative game designers. And they sort of use it at the beginning of their career, make a name for themselves, and then kind of move on and move towards a more proprietarian model. But, the license is being used in a way that complements commercial revenue generating enterprises. And, I think the best indication of that is the company that owns Dungeons and Dragons now is Hasbro. It's one of the world's 2 largest toy and game manufacturers, and they continue to release their products using the Open Game License. And this is one of the most valuable brands in the gaming world. They sell tens of millions of dollars of product every year, despite the fact, and frankly, I would argue, as a result of the fact that its core is available under the Open Game License.
So a big part of your dissertation is also the actual study that you did. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the subject of your study, the sort of methodology, and sort of what you were looking for and what you found in the course of the study that you conducted.
Sure. So as you mentioned, it was a qualitative study. So I did semi-structured interviews with individuals and representatives of companies in the role-playing game industry who release product or have released product using the Open Game License. And one of the fascinating things to me about the study was how nuanced and thoughtful the people who use the Open Game License are about their use of it. So I was sort of expecting that I was going to encounter, a bunch of people who, when I asked them, why did you use this? And essentially, are you happy with the fact that you've used it? Did you sort of accomplish your goals? I was kind of expecting, and I don't want to caricature the expectation, but I was kind of expecting I was going to get a bunch of sort of, I'll call it the hippie response, right? Like this notion that, I don't really like, money doesn't mean anything to me. I'm here to create and I'm here to share, and I just really love sharing, and sharing is the most important thing in my life. And there were a few people who were like that, and genuinely so, from what I could tell. But there were a lot of people who were quite, instrumental in describing how they used it. And so they said, look, there's benefits that I get from sharing. I'm happy to, leverage the license and use it in a way which, results in benefits to me. But at the same time, I just kind of like seeing people take my stuff and enjoy themselves, and create their own new content, based on the materials that I've licensed and made available to them. And so, I was talking again across a fairly, broad spectrum of undertakings. So, the guy in his bedroom, all the way to, operations that have dozens and dozens of employees. And I was just sort of struck by how kind of variegated the responses were. I was expecting to get a much more kind of cynical set of answers, and they're really, the people who use license tend to have thought about it quite a bit. And like I said, they're quite thoughtful in describing what it is that they're doing and why they're doing it.
Mm-hmm. So Bob, in closing, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what you think your study of open source licensing in the context of the Dungeons and Dragons open gaming license can tell us more generally about the social role of open source and how we ought to think about that in relation potentially to other sort of content industries, as it were.
I think the default assumption in most content industries is that the only viable way to exploit the content is through a closed approach. In other words, the only way to make money is really by locking down the content and making sure that it's accessible and used only in a fairly constricted way, with an eye towards maximizing revenue at the point of use, so that every use necessarily sort of generates some kind of payment to the licensor or owner. And I think what I've discovered, or what the story that I tell demonstrates, is that that's not necessarily the case for all types of content, across all types of industries, and for all types of licensors. I think there is a sort of sweet spot for a variety of different types of creative expression, where this type of open approach can be used really productively. I think you have to be smart about it. I don't think it's for everybody. I don't think it's for every type of work. I certainly wouldn't argue that, every sort of Hollywood major studio picture should be released under an open content license. But I think there are a significant number of properties out there, I'll use that term, which could really benefit from a more open approach. And I'll take the example because it's sort of an adjacent area that I touched on a little bit in my dissertation, of fan fiction. I think there are certain content owners who look at the phenomenon of fan fiction and recoil from it. And, their instinct is to say, well, how do we shut this down, or how do we marginalize this, or how do we control it? And then there's other content owners who look at it and say, this is amazing. Like, people are really engaged with our work. They just want to talk, not just want to talk about it, but they want to talk about it. They want to share it with their friends. They want to use it to inspire their own creativity. And, from both a normative perspective, but I think also from a commercial perspective, I think the second approach in a lot of cases is the better one. And so I think open content licenses are one way by which content owners can, maximize the reach of their content, and can maximize the sort of the impact of their content, because it really lets people engage with it in a way which is much more productive. Whatever metric you want to use for describing productive, and in a way which I think ultimately, redounds to the benefit of the content owner and the audience members who are making use of it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And thanks so much, Bob, for coming on the show. I really enjoyed reading your dissertation. And honestly, I don't read dissertations all that often. This one's, stands apart from the pack, as it were. And it was really great to hear from you about this cool subject and your really interesting study as well. So I hope other people can have access if they want to check out the information in your dissertation as well.
Great. Thanks so much, Brian. Really enjoyed it.
break.
I don't like this.
Whoa! What's happening? Whoa! Where are we? Look out!
Fear not, stranger. Barbarian, magician, thief, cavalier, and acrobat.
Who was that?
That was Venger, the force of evil. I am Dungeon Master, your guide in the realm of Dungeons and Dragons.